here it goes, which also comes out of a program that George and Nancy Vernon and I are taking, which is a lay leadership course, a course designed to help folks who want to lead service and become more competent, think more deeply about the Bible. So we've been taking that course. So this is also an attempt to change style and get uncomfortable. Another thing that happened in this lay worship leaders course is I went last week. George and Nancy have been twice to Kenora. We do it over the next 2 years. But one of the first assignments I got was a question, which was, at this point in your life, which biblical character do you most associate with? Do you think you're most like? And although some of us, George, hated that question. And in fact, I thought your response was very interesting. I actually kind of paused and thought and thought fairly deeply about it. And I realized when I was young, I think like most young people, I always sort of thought one of the heroes of the Bible, you know, Daniel or David or Abraham, I don't know, somebody that was doing some action. And that kind of was the person I thought probably I was most like. But when I think about it deeply, when I try to think about it honestly, I think about my very comfortable house. I think about, you know, our exorbitant wealth that we have. I think about the fact that I'm up here and allowed to lead service. I think about how, you know, on Sundays I can lead service. On Mondays, although it's maybe not the Roman Empire, I go sit at council, so there's some community leadership there. And I think, I'm not David, I'm one of the Pharisees. And the Pharisees really come off badly in the Bible. They're the folks that are leading the temple, they're the folks that are on community councils, they're the folks that are on the library board. The Pharisees were good people. The Pharisees were people who were committed to social justice within their communities. They wanted to see things improve. They worked within the system. And I realized that's, you know, in the Middle Age, that's probably who I am. And that's a problem, because in the Bible, the Pharisees are the whipping boys. They're the ones that are always being chastised by Jesus. And so the other gift that I feel that this lay worship leaders course has offered me is a chance to look back at the Bible, to read the Bible with all of these other texts that are thinking about it and kind of encounter it again. And I guess the simple message that I'm getting from that process is the Bible's not what we think. And the message of Jesus probably isn't what we think. Through no fault, I think, of anybody's, there's 2,000 years of church history between us and Christ. And lots of that is where the church is the power in the world, the Holy Roman Empire. The Catholic Church with a big C, with the big buildings, and the churches were powerful. They were invested in this world. Christ's message is radically different from that. And so when I think about the message and the message from this story, I try to see it through those eyes. So the first thing I'm going to do is we're going to talk about this very strange story of Christ, or Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem. The first part that's so strange about the story is the horse rustling part. You know, basically Jesus says, go hijack me a horse and we're going to ride into Jerusalem. And when the disciples, who are kind of dumbfounded by this, show up and find this horse exactly as described in a village on the Mount of Olives, and they're taking it, they're stealing it, and they get confronted. They simply say, the master needs it. And the person who's having their horse stolen says, good enough. There's a very strange sort of dynamic going on in that story. And what's interesting is when we look back at Zechariah, the reading that Carol did, the Bible, especially the New Testament, is always trying to fulfill the prophecies of the Old Testament. In Zechariah it says, shout for joy, you people of Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you. He comes triumphant and victorious, but humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. That really, what Mark is trying to say, what the Gospels are trying to say, is that this entry into Jerusalem on a pony is a fulfillment of the prophecies. It's a fulfillment of the promise of God. And that we can't read the New Testament without remembering that the gospel writers are always trying to do that. And I thought, fantastic sermon, that's what I'm going to do. But it is, I just think, a really interesting point that sometimes the strange aspects of stories in the Bible are really about a theological or a political agenda on the part of the writers. So that kind of explains why the horse is there. The part that's more interesting to me, and the thing that I think I always forget, and as a Pharisee, the thing that I think is most important is there's but one power at the time of Christ. It's not God, it's Rome. That you can't understand the Bible, and I would argue you can't understand our world without understanding the power structures that are around you. And so what Christ is always doing is playing himself off against Rome, playing himself off against Caesar. And so a little art history, George. Here's a typical column in Rome. I mean, their public buildings were much nicer than ours. And this is a brief from a column. It's called a Roman triumph. And it's essentially what would happen is after a victory in battle, the Romans would come back with Caesar amongst them, riding these great war horses, parade through Rome to show off, one, that their army was the most powerful, two, to show the spoils of war, and three, to cement the kind of pageantry that comes with leadership. That this is very much a tradition in Rome where you show off your power. The next image is a kind of an imagination of what these things look like. And you can see you've got a trumpet player over on the right. You've got Caesar in the middle with the midriff exposed, the mantle of power, the robe, the crown, all kinds of war imagery. Everybody dressed up. This great triumphant march back into Rome. In fact, it's called the Roman triumph. And I don't think you can understand what Christ is doing a lot of the times unless we understand that he's often setting himself up against Caesar. And Caesar isn't a person, Caesar is a title, or many Caesars. And in fact, even when we think about the crucifixion is a Roman torture. The idea of crucifixion is it's the most humiliating, it's the most painful, and it's the most public way to kill somebody. These crosses weren't kind of put off into a corner for people to die. They were put along roadways, major roadways, so that when you came into a city, you would see what happens when you mess with Rome. Because crosses were left just for political people who were messing with Rome. And Jesus is always messing with Rome. And so that, in fact, is part of the imagery of Jesus against Rome. The next photo or image, this one and the next one, are artist conceptions of what it would have looked like with Christ coming in. One of the things, it's sometimes nice to just have an image, because it brings the story alive, but the thing that I see is how silly it looks. Here you have a grown man, and you know, the blonde-haired Jesus that I remember is about 6 feet tall, and he's riding a child's donkey. That donkey is way too small for him. And here he comes, and instead of swords and armies on his march, we have children with palms. It's, in a very real way, Jesus parodying a Roman triumph. It's supposed to make fun of it, but it's also supposed to say, look, I can be a king too. Now, there's some differences between Christ's entry into Jerusalem and what Caesar would do. The biggest one is, when Caesar comes into Rome, he marches through the city, he shows off the spoils of war, and he comes to the throne, he comes to the center of power, and he retakes his seat. And for many of the people watching this, what they're hoping for is the Messiah, the return of the King David, the return of the glory of Israel. For most of the people in this crowd, they are waiting for a very real renewal of Jewish power in the world. But Christ comes into Jerusalem, and we listen to what happened to him. He comes into Jerusalem, the throngs are there, the crowds are there, high hosannas, hail, hail Jesus, hail Victor, hail Messiah. He comes to the temple, which is the place of power, and it says he looked at everything. And then he left. He doesn't stay. He looks around, he looks at the temple, and it says because it was late, he left with his 12 disciples and went back to Bethany. So he has this triumphant march into Jerusalem. He comes to the temple, to the place where the people expect him to become the new King David, and he leaves. And that's the thing to me that I keep coming back to what the Bible is. It's not what I remember, and it's more challenging than I thought. And Jesus does come back to the temple the very next day. He doesn't come on a donkey. He doesn't come with crowds. And what does he do? He goes into the temple and he starts throwing out money lenders. He starts destroying tables. He starts throwing out coins and screaming at people. He is a madman. And this is how he comes back. And I remember George said to me on the ride back, he said, well, Jesus was the original Occupy Wall Street protester. I thought, putting my Pharisee hat back on, when I watch the Occupy Wall Street movement, I think, I understand that sense of wanting change. I understand that wanting to make a statement, but I think they don't offer anything practical. What they say is, we want the corporate system to change. We want, that our lives are bought and sold by mega companies to change. And I think, but you're not kind of telling us how. You're just saying you want change. And I think that makes me very nervous because when I think about my house and the money we have and things that I have, I don't want change so much. Like, I want change, but I want that kind of change. I want like 1030 church start change. I don't want, living in a tent change. And yet, that seems to be what Christ is offering us. That he comes in like the new King David through Jerusalem to the temple, but he won't stay. He won't take that seat. Instead, he comes back and he says, no, I want you to change everything. We're not asking, and lots of times we think about replacing Caesar with Jesus. That if we just had a better leader, that system would be more just and everything would be okay. And I think often when I'm working in the community, that's how I think. That, you work within the system, you just keep making the system better, there'll be more justice for everybody, more equality for everybody. But that's not what's in the Bible. What Jesus says is you need to do away with the system, and you need to change. And that real change means the sort of thing we're about to see during Easter week, which is the biggest, strangest transformation in human history. That change from Jesus to Christ, that change from death to new life, that change from everything you knew, that world of Rome, that world of comfort, into this life of Christ, which is what? New, challenging, change. And I just realize when I say, I think I'm a Pharisee, that change makes me really nervous. And that I think all we can do is, with Christ, just ask to be strong and open to those changes. That maybe we're called to be something more. Maybe we're called to do something more. And that no matter what biblical character you associate with yourself right now in your life, that Christ is saying, with me, you can be like me, or you can be part of me, or we as together can live out Christ's kind of image of change as the original Occupy Wall Street kind of guy. And so I think, a Pharisee like me talks about change. And then when I read a story like this, it gives me a chance on the eve of Easter to say, what kind of change do I really want? What kind of change am I willing to embrace? And it's not an answer, but I think it's a really important question to sit on the edge of Easter with.